In this nugget, you and I get to take a look at the concept of storage DRS, implement it in a vSphere environment, and then verify it works. Let's begin. One of the things that's fun about a vSphere DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, is that if we have a cluster, which we do in our lab, DRS can dynamically move a virtual machine from one host that's really busy, for example, over to another host that's less busy. And that's with DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler. In addition, if we create a new virtual machine, instead of specifying we want it on ESXi2 or ESXi3, we just specify that we want the compute resource to be the cluster, and then we allow DRS to make the decision on which ESXi host is the best candidate to support that new VM. Well, that idea about Distributed Resource Scheduler and picking the best ESXi host based on CPU and memory utilization, that is such a good idea that we can also apply the concept of DRS to data stores as well, and it's referred to as Storage DRS. And here's how it works. Let's imagine that we've got 3 data stores. Data store 1, data store 2, and data store 3. And when we create a new virtual machine, or when we're doing a migration for storage, the question comes up, which data store do you want to use? So instead of having for us to make the decision every time regarding which data store has, for example, the most space, or which data store is the least busy, what we could do is create a data store cluster. And in that data store cluster, we could include these 3 data stores. And then, when the question comes up for a migration or a new VM, which data store do we want to use? We simply point to the data store cluster, and we allow Storage DRS to make that decision for us, based on utilization and free space, and some other parameters that we can specify, so we can automate the choice regarding the initial data store that's going to be used to support a VM. Another really cool feature inside of Storage DRS is that if we have a data store that is being overutilized, so for example, maybe DS3 has tons and tons of I/O, or it's 95% utilized as far as capacity, if we enable Storage DRS automation, it can automatically move the data store for a VM off of data store 3 and over to data store 1 in the same cluster if data store 1, for example, is a better candidate. Maybe it's only 15% utilized. So if each of these data stores is 2 terabytes each, that would mean that data store 1 has a ton of space available still, and data store 3 is running out. So having the automation portion of Storage DRS can provide that functionality for us as well. And before we take a look at our game plan for implementing this in our hands-on lab, I also want to mention that the data stores that go into a data store cluster have to be of similar types, meaning we cannot have an NFS data store and an iSCSI data store be in the same data store cluster. So it's like birds of a feather flock together. Data stores in a data store cluster all need to be birds of a similar feather. So let's talk about our game plan. Currently, in our lab environment, we have an iSCSI data store, and it's currently made up of LUN 0 and LUN 1 on the iSCSI target. Now, having a data store cluster with just one data store isn't too helpful because it's only a single data store. It's just like having a cluster with only one ESXi host. So in order to take advantage of Storage DRS, we really need another iSCSI-based data store so we can put both of them inside of the data store cluster. So I had a chat with the storage provider who's providing our iSCSI target, and I said something like this: hey, I was wondering if we can get another LUN so we can go ahead and create an additional data store on iSCSI. And the response was, absolutely, anything you want. And if you're wondering, the reason that that storage provider is so cooperative is because it's me. I'm providing all the iSCSI services off of this Windows server right here. So all I did on this Windows server is I created an additional drive, set it up as part of the same iSCSI target, and so now we have LUN 2 out there available as well. So we can create a new data store. I recommend that we call it iSCSI-2. We can also rename the original data store to iSCSI-1, just for nice clean lines, and then we can put both of those into a data store cluster and then start to go ahead and use it. So that, my friend, is our game plan. Let's go to the hands-on lab and implement it. Here in the vSphere web client, let's first of all get the new data store created. So what we'll do is we'll right-click on the Las Vegas data center. In the Actions drop-down, we'll go to Storage. And what I'm going to do first is select Rescan Storage. Because if there's new resources out there, I want to make sure that the ESXi hosts know about them. So right here, we can cause a new scan to happen. Now, we don't need a scan yet for new volumes because we haven't created one yet. So we'll just do a scan for new storage devices, click on OK, and then we click on Recent Tasks, It's showing us that it's doing a rescan on all HBAs, and it's going through ESXi 1, 2, and 3, and that's fantastic. So we'll go ahead and minimize recent tasks. If we wanted to verify that on one of our hosts, we could click on one of our hosts. For example, let's click over here on the left, ESXi 2. And while working with the vSphere web client, if you click on an object and it doesn't respond, you might want to do a refresh up here. And that refresh will often allow you to go back and choose your object and select it if it's giving you any grief. So with ESXi 2 selected, let's click on the Configure tab right here. And then under Storage and Storage Adapters, if we click on the iSCSI host adapter, and with it selected, down here click on Devices. Now it's showing us that it can see LUN 0, LUN 1, and at the moment the unused LUN 2. And that should be the same for ESXi 1 and ESXi 3. I just want to make sure that our ESXi host could see that. So now, to create a new iSCSI data store, we can go ahead and right-click on the Las Vegas Data Center. From the drop-down, hover over Storage, and then we'll simply click on New Data Store. It's going to go in the Las Vegas Data Center. We'll click Next. It's going to be a VMFS data store. We'll click Next. Let's name this iSCSI 2, and then we'll leverage a host to go out and tell us what it sees out there. So leveraging ESXi 1, we could also leverage ESXi 2 and 3. They should all have the same view. It's showing us the LUN 2 that's being provided by the iSCSI target. So with that selected, we'll click on LUN 2 and then click on Next. We're going to use VMFS 6. We don't need any backwards compatibility. Click on Next. And let's go ahead and use the full space, which is 79 gigs. We'll click on Next and click on Finish. And then we'll click on Recent Tasks just to verify that that is going to complete. And it has. Fantastic. All right, so with that new data store created, and just for grins, I'm going to right-click on the Las Vegas Data Center, hover over Storage. From the submenu, select Rescan Storage, and I am going to ask them meaning the ESXi host in this data center, to scan for new volumes. And click OK. That won't hurt anything. So each of the ESXi hosts should now be completely aware of not only the new LUN 2, but also the new VMFS data store that we created out of that LUN. So I'm going to click on Cluster 2 to bring the focus back here. And with Cluster 2 selected, if we click on the Data Stores tab, it's showing us that we've got this additional data store, iSCSI 2, and also I'm going to go ahead and rename the original iSCSI data store. We can just right-click it right here. And for the Actions menu for our original iSCSI data store, we'll simply go down to Rename. We'll click on Rename, and we'll call this iSCSI-1. And with that new name put in, we'll click OK. Fantastic. Also, we have a button here under Data Stores for Data Store Clusters, and at the moment, we don't have any Data Store clusters, but we can fix that right now. To create a new Data Store cluster, we just go to the Data Center, right-click, and this option, New Cluster, that's for a cluster of ESXi hosts and associated resources. What we want is we want to go down under Storage, and then from the submenu, we want to, from here, create a new Data Store cluster. And that's the object that's going to contain the data stores. So we'll click on New Data Store Cluster off of the Storage submenu, and then we'll go ahead and give it a name. For our purposes, we'll just call it Data Store Cluster. It's asking, do you want to turn on DRS for this data store cluster? And our answer is going to be sure. So we'll leave that check there. Click on Next. It's asking us, do we want to have this automated or do you want manual mode? If we leave it automated, vSphere is going to look at the data stores and their utilization and their use and do automatic movement of the VM files based on the settings. Now, for the lab environment, I want to go ahead and not have it start moving large amounts of files automatically. I wouldn't mind seeing the recommendations periodically, but in the lab, I want to be in control of large data movement. So we'll say no automation, manual mode, so it can make recommendations. Just like vSphere DRS could offer us recommendations, so can Storage DRS. And so for all of these settings, the default is to use the cluster settings. We could tweak them here if we wanted to. We'll click on Next to continue. This checkbox here gives us the option, if we want to, of using iometrics to be considered part of the Storage DRS recommendations. So for the lab, I'm going to go ahead and deselect that to not use the iometrics. Also, I want to point out that in this virtualized lab environment, if you do enable that, there will be a nastygram and a failure message regarding the creation and movement of the data stores into the data store cluster. So just as a heads up, in the lab environment, we're not going to use the iometric option for consideration. Next, we have the Storage DRS thresholds, and we can move this all the way down to 50%. Which means, hey, if we have more than 50% storage utilization on a data store, that's going to be something important that could trigger a recommendation from Storage DRS. We also have an I/O latency threshold. By default, it's 15 seconds, which means if the ESXi host makes a request to the data store on behalf of its VMs, and then gets a response, if that response is over 15 milliseconds, then that also could be a trigger for a storage DRS recommendation regarding moving some files. So with the utilized space at 50% and the enable I/O metric for SDRS recommendations disabled, let's go ahead and click on Next. Next, it's asking us who requires connectivity to the data stores that are going to be in this cluster. And we're going to specify cluster 2. Now, it's true that cluster 1 and ESXi1 in cluster 1 also has connectivity, but we're not putting any new VMs on ESXi1 because he's really busy just supporting the vCenter server appliance. So we're going to select cluster 2 and click on Next. Now it's asking us, hey, which data stores do you want to put in this data store cluster? And we are going to choose iSCSI1 and iSCSI2. If we tried to choose all three, including the NFS data store, and we clicked on Next, wah, 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 you can't do mixed types. So we'll go ahead and remove the NFS data store. And with iSCSI1 and iSCSI2 selected only, we'll click on Next. So here's a summary. We can scroll down for additional information about what's about to happen. And we'll click on Finish. So we can click on Recent Tasks. And here on Recent Tasks, we created a data store cluster. There was some configuration done on it, and data stores were moved into that data store cluster. Fantastic. So we'll minimize Recent Tasks. And now with Cluster 2 selected, and the Data Stores tab selected, and the Data Store Clusters button or subtab here selected, it's now showing our data store cluster. We could also see that cluster by going over to the Storage tab right here in the Navigator pane. And it shows up here, and we could expand that as well. And it would show us the two members inside of that data store cluster. With that cluster selected, if we click on the Configure tab, here's where we could configure DRS. So if we wanted to modify the parameters of it, we could select under Services Storage DRS. And then over here in the upper right, we can click on Edit Storage DRS Settings. And from here, we could expand these options and tweak them and customize them to our liking. So we're going to leave them as they are. I'm going to click on Cancel. And with the data store cluster still selected, if we click on the Monitor tab and we click on Performance, here it's showing us space utilization. So it's including iSCSI1 and iSCSI2. And this little icon down here is just a reminder that to see this information, we'd go ahead and click in this space, which I just did, and that'll bring it up for us. So iSCSI1 is here. Here's the legend regarding the color coding. And iSCSI2 is about half its size and doesn't have very much utilization regarding space. Also on the Monitor tab, if we go to the Storage DRS subtab here, this is where it would show us the recommendations, if there were any, the faults, and the history regarding what it's done. So at the moment there's no history, but let's give it some. Let's give it some history. Let's give Storage DRS something to do. So to do that, what we could do is let's create a brand new VM. So to create a new virtual machine, since we're right here in the storage view, we can right click on Las Vegas Data Center. From the Actions menu, we could select New Virtual Machine, and then from the submenu, we could click New Virtual Machine, or we could go ahead and create a new virtual machine from the library. Let's go ahead and do a new virtual machine. And from here, we have several choices. And because we have templates, we could go ahead and create one from a template. We could clone an existing virtual machine. In fact, let's do that. So with this third option here, clone an existing virtual machine, and click on Next. Now it's asking us, who do you want to clone from? So we'll dig down to the Las Vegas Data Center, into the VMs folder, and let's go ahead and clone from VM1. So with VM1 selected, let's click on Next. And let's name this bad boy VM-5. And we'll place that in the VMs folder, click on Next. Now for a compute resource, because we have clusters of ESXi hosts, we can just choose the cluster instead of specifying an individual host. So we'll choose cluster-2 and we'll let vSphere DRS decide which ESXi host to place that on, and then we'll click on Next. And then, the piece de resistance regarding Storage DRS, because we have Storage DRS, instead of specifying the individual data store that we want to place the files on, we can just go ahead and choose Data Store Cluster. Then we can specify the format for the disk. Let's go ahead and use thin provisioned. And then we can click on Next. So if for some reason here we didn't want to specify the data store cluster, but we wanted to go ahead and literally say the individual data store, we still have that option. We can use this checkbox to disable Storage DRS for this virtual machine, and then we can specify the individual data store that we want to use. But heck, since we have the cluster, let's go ahead and use it. So I'm going to remove that check from the checkbox. We're going to click on Data Store Cluster, and with it highlighted, we'll click on Next. So we're going to clone, it's going to source it from VM1, it's going to make a new VM5. It's going to put it in that folder. It's going to get a compute resource from cluster 2. And for the data store, it's going to use data store cluster. And it's choosing iSCSI1. And iSCSI1 does have a ton of free space, and it's twice the size of iSCSI2. And if we clicked on more recommendations right here, and we could go ahead and use the recommendation 2, which is going to put both the configuration file and the hard disk files on iSCSI2. I love how it's taking credit for this. Here's my recommendation, and here's my second recommendation. So either way, we're accepting a recommendation from Storage DRS, regardless of which radio button here we select. So we'll choose recommendation 2. This will also help us verify that iSCSI-2 is working, and that we're able to read and write to it and everything else. So with that second radio button selected, we'll click on Apply Recommendations, and that was showing us it's choosing iSCSI-2, and we'll click on Finish. So if we look at recent tasks, that'll take a little bit to complete. I think there's like 4 or 5 gigabytes of actual used space based on who we're cloning from. So now, if we go to the data store cluster with the monitor tab selected and storage DRS selected, if we go to the history, it's going to show us that recommendation, which we accepted with the second radio button, to do the initial placement of the files for that new VM, VM5, on iSCSI2. In this nugget, we've done 3 basic things. Number 1, we identified the concept of a data store cluster. 2, we implemented one in the vSphere environment in the hands-on labs. And 3rd, we verified that it was working. So enjoy the hands-on lab and getting some additional practice, and I'll see you, my friend, in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.